State Representative and Senator Gary Winfield, because I know I'm exhausted, so I can't even imagine how they're feeling. So we just want to send a special prayer out to them. Thank you.
Hey everybody, I'm John Selvius, co-founder of More Monday CT. Just need to pump my own stuff. We've been here 10 days. Wow. In camp right there. Fasting. As a faith leader, I got to go to my faith, right? Got to lean into my faith. Fasting has been used as a way of spiritual practice and discipline. It's also been a political tool used for the purposes of changing hearts, minds, countries, nations, and in fact the world. And so we've done both. We put them together. We've been here calling for the legislature and the governor to call special session right now. First order of business, policing. See it very connected to solitary confinement and what we need to do. And let's have the robust conversation. What's wrong with having a good conversation about all of it?
That's right.
If I was at my church, I would have got an amen right there. Amen. Got an amen right there. Right. So, why don't we do this? Our sister asked us to pray. That's what I'm going to do. Frederick Douglass said, I prayed for 20 years. Got no answer until I started praying with my legs. So for me, a form of prayer is to kind of do the right thing right now, work all of us are required to do. So if you haven't already, if you're a citizen of this state, you need to be in touch with your legislator, your state senator, your state representative, and say, get on back in here to the people's house and get about doing the business of the people, right?
Right.
Also, don't leave the governor out the way.
That's right.
Hit him up as well. And let's get on back in here and let's deal with the issues that are important to us. Come on, join me in a word of prayer. God in heaven, thank you for the opportunity that we have to do what we can do. We can mix our power with your power, creating ultimate power, Ashe. So, God, we ask you to be present with us, to be present with our state representatives and our state senators and our government, our governor, and all of the ancillary people who call for and make sure that the people's business done in the people's house is in fact done appropriately and rightly. Right now they slow dragging, God. They're taking the time, God, while we have an encampment in Bridgeport. Every small town and middle-sized town and big town in the state of Connecticut is having Black Lives Matter rallies, God. We got folk turned up all over the place in this country and in the world. We need to be heard. We need our elected officials to do what is right by us, because it's about us at this moment. Black Lives Matter. So God, our prayer is that you would embolden us to speak the truth even if it hurts. To speak the truth while we're mad. To speak the truth in our outrage. To help us speak the truth while we're hurting and sad. God, help us to speak the truth, but not only that, God, we need also you to help us to listen. Help us to absorb. Help us to get in there and really understand one another so that we come out with not just okie-doke policies. We need the best policies. God, we want to lead in this moment so that black people and brown people not ever again be shot down at the hand of police. God, this is just one servant's prayer. And we pray this simple prayer in your name and for our sake, for your sake. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
I definitely want to thank him for that. I guess I'm going to start off. I'm going to start off with a quote that Gary Winfield sent us, because he couldn't be here today. But I know his heart's here with us. Gary said, the call of this moment is to look again at the lack of equity in the systems that exist in our society. When we are called into session, this must be what undergirds the work we do then and going forward. Whether it be on police accountability, prison reform, or a host of other issues, we must center in our work the concept of equity and the voices we have heard across the nation for the last several weeks. That comes from our esteemed Senator Gary Winfield Holder, who had 3 meetings today, so he couldn't make it today. And as I said, I want us to think about Robin Porter, who had to just take a break from all of this because this work is just so exhausting. And so I'm hoping that we think about her as we go forward with the work that we're doing. And remember, as we do the work out here, the bigger job is on the inside, and that's where she has to have her energy for. So I understand why she couldn't be here today. So I want to start off because really right now I'm a little burdened with all of this stuff. So I'm going to start from calling up other speakers first, and then I'll speak later. I want to start, I think, with Josh Elliott, one of the legislators here in Connecticut, who will be helping to push forth our the bills that we're trying to put forward. And then I'm going to call up Kenneth Green, who's a former legislator, who I have to say I really, really miss in Hartford. I asked him, did he miss it? And he said no, so I guess we won't be seeing him come back. But I'd also like to just get a few words from him. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I want to start off by acknowledging first my whiteness and first my maleness and the privilege of being an elected official. At a moment where it's more important than ever to be echoing and amplifying the voices of allies, I am uncomfortable being up here at the podium for fear that there's a perception that I speak for the movement. And I want to be clear that I recognize that I intend to speak with the movement, and I recognize in myself what some of my other white colleagues are feeling, and I think a lot of that comes from a place of shame. I am making a concerted effort to make my re-election campaign about this movement now, and having difficult conversations with other white folk. I'm seeing among my colleagues a quiet, as I think that many of you are seeing too. And when I'm out there saying defund the police, and I'm echoing the voices that are in the streets, my mom texts me and says, "Josh, I think you're being extreme." And I know that this is going to be the first of many conversations for me while I talk to other white constituents. And that pales in comparison to a lifetime of having to explain your position, where for me, it's an abstraction, but for the people that I want to fight for, it's not. It's life and death. It's feeling uncomfortable living in the neighborhood where you're from. It's uncomfortable living in the skin that you were born with. And when we talk about defund, and this is what I understand, and the reason I talk about these things vocally is so that I provide the opportunity for people to tell me where and how I'm wrong. And I think that's hard for other white legislators to do. And so what I try to do is explain to other white legislators that it's okay to be wrong and vocalize, to give yourself an opportunity to be right, to be with the movement. And when I speak about defund, my understanding is that this is a process. Defund is the goal, and it's a process to get there. It's recognizing the inherent systemic inequities that were built into the system that aren't a surprise because they were built that way intentionally. And the reason we even have police was because we treated people as chattel. And the intent of police at the outset was for governmental control. And here we are, hundreds of years later, still addressing issues that communities of color have known, have been here at the start. And it's very, very hard for white folk to recognize that reality. And there's a surprise at the level of movement that there is now for some folk, and for some folk it's, I don't understand why it took so long. My fear is that we missed the opportunity, because I think we have an opportunity to make some deep systemic changes. On the other hand, we do have champions like Senator Gary Winfield, and we do have champions like Representative Robin Porter, who I can tell you there's nobody better in this building to be doing this work right now at this moment to ensure that we get legislation with teeth, that this isn't just to say we're going to do enough to make sure that people are happy enough that they go home and we can go back to normal, because we know that normal isn't good enough. And this isn't just about police accountability. This is about ensuring that we treat humans like humans and we end solitary confinement. We need to recognize that you can't be simply labeled by your worst act, and there's no such thing as a murderer or a rapist. We are people who can make mistakes on a wide spectrum, and it just so happens that through years of legislation, we have kept laws in place that disproportionately affect black and brown bodies. So this movement needs to be so much more than police accountability. At the same time, we also need to not lose sight that this is a first step. This needs to be the first step. We need to ensure that people can stay in touch for free when they are behind bars and they are incarcerated, because we expect people to come back to the communities, and we expect them to be successful, and we expect them to go back to their families and remain whole. We expect our institutions to treat people civilly like they're human beings, so that when we change our system and we reimagine our system, it ends up being about rehabilitation and love and not about punishment and vengeance. And we need to ensure that our civil servants are treating people as though they are human beings, and that has never happened. And this is a moment where we can ensure through the levers of power that it does. And so I thank you all for being here. I'm going to be with you every step of the way. I will, as little as possible, try to be up on podiums, but when I'm asked to, I will try to echo and I will try to reverberate the voices that I hear from the communities that are most affected. So thank you all for being here.
Hold on, don't move. I hear you. Here's the issue. Defunding the police is, did you read Trump's executive order?
I have not read it.
Oh. Well, that's not good. So, his executive order, the whole defund the police thing, I think is something that we no longer really can even afford to worry about. Because at this point, Trump has pretty much said that as long as a program or steps are taken towards changing things in a way that makes everyone feel uncomfortable, the state police departments are allowed to get funds. The issue with that is that if you guys don't take the input from us, because I don't know if you have any plans to sit down and give any ideas or anything, and I don't know if anyone has plans, because none of you have sat down with the community and really talked it out. But because of his executive order, you guys, funds aren't even an issue at this point. What you guys need to do is you need to sit down with us. We got petitions going everywhere. We got a bunch of ideas for policing alone, and you guys need to expand on our list, and you need to adhere to our demands, because our demands are no longer unfeasible. his executive order made it possible for us to achieve a lot. But they have to be in alignment with what's good. And you should know what is morally good at this point. So, I mean, you might want to read the executive order, you know, first and foremost. But you need to sit down with those of us in the community that have come up with solutions, that have come up with ideas. It's not our job to come up with ideas, it's your job. But you guys need to sit down with us to expand on whatever it is that you guys have come up with. I just wanted to say that because defunding the police is no longer really an issue. It was great before the executive order. You guys defunded and you're going to redistribute. That's another thing that you guys have to sit down and talk with the community about. Because you're talking about redistributing funds from the police department, but where are those funds going? We need to know. Our education systems need funds. Certain programs need to be brought back because you took fundings away from important programs that taught me and people around my age how to read. Those need to come back, and newer programs need to come back. We can't keep our communities dumb anymore. It's not okay. Especially now after COVID, there are 2 million students that haven't done any classwork all over this country. It's not, you guys need to sit down and you gotta make haste. It can't be just out here talking in circles. You didn't even read the executive order. I'm kind of upset.
While there is an executive order in place, and I will read that, I will say that in Connecticut, we can address these problems in the way that we see fit, and the problem is of listening just to federal government, we're going to get a lot of noise. And so I hear what you're saying. I would also push back to say that we are going to be in a better position than the federal government is to make some really important steps towards equity, correct. So I agree with everything that you said.
We got to talk.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm going to call up former Representative Kenneth Green, just to give us some idea what can we expect, going forward. I'm learning a little bit about, when we open this session what's going to happen, but I'm really kind of clueless, so I'm hoping that former Representative Kenneth Green will help us out. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, my name is Ken Green. I am a licensed clinical social worker, retired from the school system after doing 30 years working with young people who had emotional and behavioral problems. At the same time that I was a school social worker, I was a state representative for 16 years, and I represented Hartford and Bloomfield. I was born and raised in Hartford, and part of when I grew up was that if I had the opportunity to be educated, to see, based on what I had seen growing up, my thought was to come back to my community and see how I could be a positive and healthy contributor to my community. And so I came back after school and got into social work to change things. To this brother that just asked a question, I would ask that brother to make sure he contacts Barbara Fair and Reverend Sheldon before you leave, and that part of what he said and part of what I think you need to think about is that everybody and a lot of people are taking different paths on a different roads to get to the same place. And what happens sometimes is that we think that we're in opposition to each other. That's not what is happening. And so people have to share their knowledge and their skills and their support for one another. And so what he can do and what his organization can do, maybe the solitary and the police accountability can't do, but together they could do more. Now, a couple of things happened. He talked about, and I think he talked about the executive order from the president. We also had an executive order from our governor. And we're also talking about maybe going into special session. And if you look at also some of the legislation on the federal level, the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, they have added a lot of stuff in response to what's going on today. These things that are going on today are not new. This was happening 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, and people of black and brown persuasion, it's been happening to us since our connection and interaction with this country. It's been unfortunate. So this is not anything new. But I think we might be, because we always want to be hopeful, and I always want to be hopeful, we might be at a point that some serious conversation is being made and being had to really talk about some changes. Now, government will provide one part of that change. Now, let me just very quickly, since it's on my mind, I'm old, I forget. Representative Elliott from Hampden. This is an election year for state offices now. Some people have primaries in August, possibly. There's very few, based on a lot of people I think can't get signatures, but there'll be elections in November. From now until November, everyone should have their representative and their state representative and their state senator have community meetings and explain what the executive order means, what it is that the legislation from the task force will be, and if you get that information, you question, what does it do to protect me? What does it do to hold police accountable? You can have those conversations now. So when you get a fancy flyer, I ran campaigns. I was here for 16 years. We send out nice glossy flyers. We will probably deal with 4 issues: education, healthcare, seniors, and the jobs. You'll see that. Education, seniors, the job. We very rarely talked about racism, inequality, equity, discrimination. We rarely talked about that. It is not a good topic for a lot of politicians to talk about. But we have them talking about it now. When I ran for office a long time ago, I ran my primary and my major piece of legislation that I wanted to promote was restoring voting rights to ex-offenders. All right, and it got passed, and it took me 8 years from the time I got in, 8 years later, for me to get legislation to restore voting rights to those folks who are on probation. And so then I had to do a campaign about educating those folks about how to vote, that they could vote, and then try to encourage them to vote. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work. So there's a lot of work for all of us to do. There's a lot of work for all of us to do. Before the legislators come back into special session, I would challenge all of us to have our state senators and our state representatives hold a community meeting and explain the executive order, explain the bill that they're going to propose, and get the input before they come back up in special session, because once they come up in special session, the deal is done. If they call them back to vote, the deal is done. That's just the process. If they, and Representative Elliott can tell me if I'm kind of like offbeat, I'm learning and I take input. But if they call them back in session with legislation, basically the deal is done. So if the deal is done, you need to know and we need to know what's in the deal before they come back. And if you're waiting for them to tell you that, you're not going to have the kind of input that you need to have before the deal is done. So one of the things you can do is you can have community meetings with your representatives to ask them these questions now. So if Connecticut, Solitary Connecticut, if the Police Accountability Task Force, if any other group wants to hold it, have a series of meetings at the same time that we continue to have the protest, have a series of meetings to say, explain this to us. Now, the federal government has a list. The Justice and Policing Act, when you read it and you digest some of that, and it's still fluid, it's a good first step. It really encompasses a lot of things in terms of what states should follow and implement on their level, and possibly more. So here's the other piece that you need to have. After this feds say this and the state says this, then you go to your local community, your mayors and your aldermen, and say, what is happening in my city that may be in conflict with what the state is doing, and how do we change our city laws to make sure they're congruent and is in sync with what the state is doing. The cities can also do some things. They don't have to always wait for the state. So there's a lot of active initiatives that you can have at the local the state, and the federal level. And if organizations want to do that, the protest has to be about what are you asking for, who are you asking it to, and what are you demanding how they get back to you on the answers. Any piece of legislation has to be more than banning chokeholds. We talked about chokeholds with Eric Gardner. Should have been banned, but they've been doing it. And just because you legislate don't mean that you're going to get the behavior that you expect because of legislation. You have to demand the behavior of the police be changed. And so accountability has to be not only about the legislation of banning chokeholds and writing reports in a certain amount of time and making sure you keep your body camera on. They have been doing those things. Body cameras have caught police acting inappropriate. They haven't stopped them from the behavior and the culture of the police department. It's a culture that has to change. That has to change because they have to have the attitude. As a social worker and as a legislator, when I was a legislator, I would have to debate sometimes that this wasn't about when we dealt with criminal justice, when we dealt with the police, it wasn't about the us versus them. You'll hear police talk about the civilians. You'll hear police talk about them. There's no them and no us. They're citizens, they're humans. Their families want them to come home at night after they work. I want my son to come home after he goes to school. I want my daughter to be able to come home after she goes to work. I want the same thing you want. But you are in a certain position of authority that your decision may have a detrimental effect on my children's decision. It's no us versus them. I want my children to come home just like you want to go home to your family. Stop thinking that it's a us versus them. And if you talk to the police, we also want to recognize their humanity, that they're citizens and they're people. But if we do that, then you as an officer also have to respect and recognize our humanity. And if you operate your job like that, the training, the encounters you have with people will be different if you encounter them with a level of respect and a level of humanity the same way that I want to give to you. I want my children to come home just like you want to go home after your job. So when you talk about police accountability, the legislation will be fine, but the legislation has to have some clear language in terms of what it is asking from the police. It has to also say and talk about if the police behave in a manner that is inappropriate to what their job responsibilities are, what are the consequences of those actions? So when you talk about qualified immunity, when you're talking about holding other officers accountable for crime when they do not act to keep a person safe and protect, even if they're being arrested, you have to hold them accountable. If you do those kind of things, when you have consequences for the legislation and the behavior that you're expecting, if you just have banning chokeholds, wearing a body camera, be respectful, and then there's no consequences if you violate those conditions, the legislation doesn't mean stuff. So doesn't mean a lot. So any piece of legislation has to have what are the consequences, are the penalties, what are the consequences to the officers if they don't do. If you don't have that, the legislation will not mean a whole lot. So have the legislation, have the consequences, and have the community continue to communicate with the officers on the local and state level in terms of working together. It is not a us versus them. Let me just finish with this by saying I was so heartbroken. Connecticut has a lot of issues, so I'm not going to get into all those issues. But let me just talk about the one that some of you may have seen in Trumbull, Connecticut, where the 10-year-old boy was playing basketball. Did anybody see that video? Nobody seen that?
That was in Trumbull?
Okay, in Trumbull. Some people right.
Trumbull.
A 10-year-old young black African-American boy is playing basketball in his yard. And when the police car comes by, he hides behind the car
Yeah.
just for a few seconds and stops until the police car drives by before he resumes playing basketball. So when you talk about racial trauma, and you're going to hear that a lot too, racial trauma. When you talk about racial trauma, we of African descent know that because of our experiences. We've been traumatized. We've done pretty good on managing our trauma. But when you see a 10-year-old boy do that, he has already been traumatized. And he's going to have a supportive family, a supportive community to possibly deal with that trauma. He won't understand that trauma right now. But it definitely shows a fear, a need to protect himself, and a possibly to make a decision to do the right thing. And even when he does that, there's no guarantee that if he has an encounter with the police, he might end up not being with us. Thank you.
Hi, Ashley Evans. I am a current rising student at Yale. You talk about demands and making demands for qualified immunity and legislation, but murder is already it's already a crime to murder someone. It seems like the issue really isn't the law, with the exception of qualified immunity, so much as with prosecutors and judges refusing to hold cops accountable. So as a legislator, someone with prior experience, what is the burden with changing laws? Because it almost seems like a money thing. We've already done the demanding thing. We've already done we've done the petitions. We've done it. Rodney King was 30 years ago, as you said. So we've been here before. It seems like there needs to be a next step other than demands. It's not about demands anymore. It's about either economic protests, boycotting donors. Something has to be the next step. And then why do we put so much focus on legislation and not prosecutors and judges? Because it doesn't matter what's in black and white. It matters how you enforce that black and white. And they're not enforcing it. So I've never met a legislator before. Hello.
Hello.
I need help because I've been protesting now I'm 28 and I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm only 28. And I'm protesting the exact same things I was protesting 10 years ago. I'm done. I'm not doing demands anymore. There has to be a step 2. As a legislator, what is that step 2? Because I don't think it's legislation. We already have the black and white. It looks like we need people to lose their jobs. And people
it's all of those things. And that's the thing is that if you assess what you think your gifts and what you're good at and what you think and how you think you can impact something, I just say work hard at that. So the legislation gives a policy and don't just think of the police, think of the criminal justice system. So when you talk about solitary, when you talk about judges, when you talk about prosecutors, when you talk about the funding for the criminal justice system, when you talk about funding in Connecticut, they're talking a lot police accountability. Part of what the effort has to be is looking at the criminal justice budget of the state of Connecticut with police, prosecutors, prisons, and talk about that. So there's a lot of things that need to be done. And first of all, don't stop fighting. Barbara and I talked about this very briefly. We're going to be fighting like this until we die. So that's just what we do. So it's kind of never going to stop. But I'm hoping that we're at a point where you're going to get past just the rhetoric. You're going to see what exactly changes. The legislation is a beginning if there's some consequences to your behavior. And then I would say the other piece I would ask the community to demand is a community-based monitoring process where you monitor the legislation that they say they want to do. So you had them come and give the community a report every six months for the first 3 years. So you're talking about 6 reports as to the progress they have in the legislation. Once they do it, you come back and you tell me, how many chokeholds have you had? How many arrests have you had? How many discharges of the firearm have you had? What happened to those officers? Murder is murder. And when you're acting as an officer, the act of certain kind of crimes is somewhat interpreted different. And I'm not going to get a lot into that, except just to say that the piece that also has to happen is the legislation has to say there's a community-based accountability group, maybe on a regional level, 6, 8, 9 county level, to monitor whatever legislation they have about police accountability, that have the power to subpoena the police, to look at the records, and to make recommendations that would be held, that they can hold those police departments to. So it's not just leaving police accountability to the criminal justice system to monitor.
Call up one more, another person who's a former correctional officer, because as we go forth for this session, we're looking at not only police accountability, we're also looking at pushing the language of how do we end solitary confinement, and we don't want that to get lost. So I want to call up Mr. Robert Gillis, who's a former correctional officer, just to talk about some of that, and specifically to make that connection between police violence on the street and correctional violence on the inside. Before you go, young lady, I just wanted to say something to you, young lady, the one who asked the question about why we do legislation. Ashley. I just wanted to say something, Ashley, about, and I think Kenny pretty much said it, but when you asked why bother with legislation, and I think he said it pretty good, but I want to make sure you understand, legislation is the one that gives all of these people, the police, the prosecutors, the judges, the language in the legislation is what gives them permission to do the things that they do. So it's important to have legislation, but what's important is that we tighten up the language, because if you don't have the right language, it gives them so much discretion to do something. So we can't give up on legislation, because those are the policies that give them the permission to stuff that they're doing and not doing. Okay?
I'm here as a member of the steering committee of Stop Solitary Connecticut. I have to correct Barbara. I was never a correctional officer. I was a warden. Okay? Which makes it somewhat more difficult for me to address these things, because in many ways I was directly responsible for the decision making by which things happened in the institution that I was responsible for running. Nonetheless, I've got considerable knowledge about the issues which have arisen in the last several weeks. And I want to focus on a limited aspect of the current agenda: solitary confinement. Regardless of the operational terms that we use to sanitize it and camouflage it. Yesterday, the New Haven Register had a position piece that was prepared by the Senate Democratic Caucus, which proposed a number of significant improvements toward achieving equitability. All kinds of things were dealt with it, but what's recognized as essential, but they know this is going to be discussed, but they go beyond police accountability, defunding, reconstructing policing, or reimagining policing. These initiatives are recognized as being essential, and we commend them for coming forward with it. Yesterday, the Current also had an opinion piece by Michael Lawler, who, as many of you know, was a former state legislator and was the assistant, or rather undersecretary of OPM for criminal justice issues. He had a number of statements that he said would really assist in making equal things that happen in our court system. Such things as mandating prosecutorial review before arraignment. I didn't know this, but Connecticut is one of the few states in which the arresting officer decides what the charges are, and the prosecutors very often don't know about them until they show up in court on the morning of arraignment. Another idea that Mr. Lawler suggested was making sure that people who pose a risk to public safety are the only ones who are held in lieu of bond at the point of arraignment. But there's something missing here. Corrections is not covered in any of these matters, and it also appears not to be on the agenda for the special session. Remember that the criminal justice system is a three-legged platform: police, the courts, and corrections. And corrections is the final point at which all of the inequities in policing, all of the inequities in court procedures come back to roost. It is the end stage. It is the final stop in the administration of justice, regardless of whether it's fair or unfair. It's the final stop. Because of this is where our efforts should be directed, and as a member of Stop Solitary, we began well over a year ago to examine and implement strategies to influence legislation to eliminate solitary confinement. Considerable discussion led to the idea that serious oversight of the Department of Correction is warranted. We learned that Connecticut is one of the very few states which has no external oversight body established by law to either set policy or to enforce standards as they exist in the correction system. And this happens in terms of just creating general policy, but also in instances of mismanagement. And we succeeded in developing proposed legislation, termed the PROTECT Act, and conducted a number of events to highlight our initiatives. The nutshell description of our mission at the time: changes in policy are required, starting with limitations on how DOC administers certain types of in-cell restrictions. We also advocated for the closing of Northern Correctional Institution and the implementation of oversight. And oversight in DOC is as important as it is in the establishment of accountability for street police officers and for policing systems. It's absolutely essential, because corrections answers only to the Judiciary Committee, and that is based on specific agendas that come up. It's not an oversight body. It is legislative body. So having accomplished all this stuff early in the year, COVID-19 came along, and that made a huge difference in our focus, because we intended to advocate the closing of Northern Correctional Institution. Well, what happened there? Northern became the place to which people who were positive for COVID-19 were sent for medical isolation. Now, I've written something here myself. They were futile. The DOC began to use it as a medical isolation center, which looks, walks, and talks like solitary confinement. Right now, COVID-19 appears to be stabilizing, but it's really the monster in the closet, because I think a number of us fear that it is going to come back out again. And when it does, DOC will be left to its own devices again to try to figure out how to manage this situation and to kind of bumble through it while they improvise a response. So the time is right now, especially, to put the need for abolition of solitary squarely on the legislative menu. And one thing I know about laws: all I have to do is reflect on my drive up here today from New Haven. Ever since there's been this release and restriction and social distancing and all that stuff, people are driving like lunatics There ought to be a law against that kind of driving, and I know there is, and yet I saw not one trooper out there on the highway. Thanks.
I want to bring up Claudine Fox from ACLU. And the organization has been doing so much work and partnering and trying to get take care of civil rights and make sure that our civil rights are guaranteed. And they filed lawsuits to get people out of prison. They've done so much. So thank you, Claudine, for being a part of that.
Hey, y'all.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Dope. Okay. So excuse me while I read from a piece of paper. Some days I'm able to spit off the top of my dome. Some days I'm not. Today is one of those days where I'm not. So here we go. So police violence and racism were problems before COVID-19, and they're still problems now. The Connecticut General Assembly must come back in for a special session this summer to do the people's work. That means a special session focused on diverting funds from policing and instead building safe and healthy communities, particularly communities that are marginalized, Black and brown communities. Completely changing the police use force of standard. So kind of what former Representative Kenneth Green was talking about, right? And ensuring that we can't expect the police to police themselves. And that is what we keep doing with banning chokeholds and, saying we'll create some kind of internal investigation unit or stuff like that. It is just continuing to expect the police to police themselves when time and time again they have proven that that's not possible. We believe creating an independent investigation unit is critical and for prosecuting police and creating an equitable COVID-19 response. I don't want us to forget that we're in the midst of two pandemics right now, right? COVID-19 is still happening. People that are incarcerated right now are still being impacted by COVID-19, regardless of what the DOC website says right now, which says that only 9 people are infected, and that as of yesterday, which don't make no sense. For the last few weeks, residents of Connecticut have marched and rallied in defense of Black and brown lives, expecting to see a response from the governor that they put into office. To ignore the cries of these communities is a slap in the face. It continues to send the message that proactively protecting marginalized communities, including people who are currently incarcerated, is not at the top of the governor's to-do list. If Lamont was serious about acting to prioritize Black lives, he would have already used his authority to call the legislature back into special session, divested from the JAG grant, which continues to provide military-grade weapons to community-based police forces. Sorry, I lost my place. The JAG grant, and instead, the money should be reinvested again back into communities of color, back to justice-impacted people, and he should have invested in executive order limiting police interactions by limiting arrests during the COVID-19 pandemic. We should not see the amount of people in prison during a pandemic stay the same. He has failed or refused to do each of those things. We demand a special session because our marginalized communities deserve to be invested in. We are people too. We deserve to be seen, we deserve to be heard, and we deserve to have our lives valued. And right now, that is not happening. Divestment from police departments. Divest from police departments. Put an end to mass incarceration and stop the over-policing of Black and brown communities. That is what we expect when we're calling for a special session. We're not asking only for a ban on chokeholds. We're not only asking for police to be expected to police themselves. Again, it is completely impossible. If our legislature cares about black and brown communities, they would listen to the people out here, the people that have been marching week after week after week, year after year after year, decade after decade after decade. And they continue to not do that. That's it. Oh.
So I have this email here. I can't reveal my source.
Sure.
But they didn't start testing staff at staff or inmates without severe symptoms till May 14th.
Yeah.
For coronavirus. So I don't know if y'all was aware of that. But
Yeah, they started that.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
it was
so
like that
I'm the campaign manager for the ACLU, and once COVID-19 happened, Smart Justice, which we've got a couple of Smart Justice folks out in the community, we really started trying to put pressure on the governor to create an equitable COVID-19 response, which included folks who are incarcerated, right? And so Smart Justice is a program that is an organizing unit, is whatever you want to call it, that like centers the voices of people that have been through the system and experience the system. And when you begin to center the people that are closest to the problem, like Representative Porter always says, you start to hear things that you've never heard before. You're able to come up with policies that regular folk don't think of, right? And so when you start organizing with folks that are closest to the problem, that kind of information starts coming out, right? And so the pressure to the governor was centered around recognizing that mass testing wasn't happening, recognizing that testing period wasn't happening until people started presenting with like, they were basically at the end, the worst of the worst part of the illness, right? And so we actually tried to sue the governor and DOC to get them to do some rapid release response, because prisons inherently, as we see with the work that Stop Solitary has been doing, right? Prisons aren't healthy. Solitary confinement isn't a healthy and equitable response to people being sick. And so
So what's your take on using Northern as the
trash.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think it's trash.
Yeah,
I think it's a trash
that's where
response.
they were moving the COVID
Yes.
positive.
This is exactly what we think.
Oh.
Yeah, we're directly in line. We see eye to eye on that. We think that was a trash response, and it was a scapegoat. For one, keeping Northern open, and two, still not dealing directly with the issue, and having them actually face the idea of what does it mean. 95% of people who are incarcerated come home to their communities, and so what does it mean where we're continuing to lock up folks that are like, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, that have been locked up for 10, 20, 30 years, right? How do we start examining like our internal biases around what it means to let a person come home in the guise of protecting them from contracting diseases, because people who are incarcerated are people too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Done? Done. Yes. Oh, did the sister ask the question about prosecutors leave?
Yeah.
Oh, we're also working on policy around how to open up that black box around prosecutors too, because again, working with people who have directly engaged with the criminal legal system, they know intimately how prosecutors have screwed them over time and time again, and that's where the ideas for policy should come from. And so we're taking that march. We passed legislation around data collection with prosecutors and how they are able to rapidly put regular people in prison but still somehow can't prosecute the police, and collecting data around that. And so there's more work around that.
So are you guys collecting any sort of data while you push for this from CSSD to figure out what your prosecution rates are, based on color, gender, things like that?
We're collecting data. We're asking states' attorneys to force their prosecutors to collect that data. So it's more from the ground up information. Okay? All right.
Quickly, is there anyone out here that needs to register to vote? We have someone out here who wants to register. I know most of the people I know already registered, but I thought I'd ask anyway. Everyone's registered. Okay, first I want to hold this sign up. And if anyone feels offended by it, they shouldn't, because this is the reality of what law enforcement is in America. It's about defending white supremacy and black inferiority. That's where it started, and that's where it's going to continue unless we do the work that we need to do to make sure that we end this. The laws that we have in America are selectively enforced, and if you look behind what their intent is, it's all about what it always has been. It's never been about protecting black and brown bodies at all. Still isn't. It's only connection they have with the law in black and brown communities is this is where we're going to enforce the law aggressively. And that's why you see prisons full with our people. So if you're offended, then that means you can't accept the fact of what goes on in America.
Woo.
This one is about police. We think police are the solution to everything. Every social problem we have, we think the police is supposed to be the one to solve it. And that's why we're in the boat that we're in now also, because police are not the solution. And I hope we can come to that so we can stop. In our communities, a lot I hear that when I talk to police chiefs, they'll say, oh, well, you know, there's problems in the community, and we're there because the people are telling us that they need us. So we need us to get out of the mindset that police are our solution to our problems. Because this way they don't have the excuse that this is why we occupy your community, because you're asking for it.
Voting only on representatives
Woo!
never worked and never will. Remember that, brother. All life matters.
Okay, thank you everyone for showing up today to support our demands to the governor, that he opened up our session. Thank you for all of the legislators and officials who showed up to help us in that effort. Across this nation, people have done whatever they found necessary to get the attention of lawmakers who have denied us real justice for over 401 years. They may be burning, they may be looting, whatever they're doing whatever they have to be seen. Because when we come up here and we talk and we're civil and we're nonviolent, nobody hears us. But you know what? They heard them in Minneapolis. They're hearing them across the state because they found another way to get justice. They just keep coming back to the same old people and thinking that they're going to give us something different. I'm hoping Connecticut doesn't have to get to that place. I'm hoping that they'll start listening to us before they start seeing what they're seeing across the nation. And I say that because the governor just made a statement recently, we don't have a police problem in Connecticut. I don't know what state he lives in, but my first memory of police violence was in 1997 with Malik Jones right in New Haven, where they shot him right in his car. And then there was then there was Franklin Reed in New Milford in 1998, shot and killed with the police officer with his boot on his back. And then there was Aquan Salmon, 14 years old, shot in the back in Hartford, 1997. Then there was Jason Negron, 15 years old, Bridgeport, 2017. Then there was Jose Cruz in Weathersfield, all Connecticut, but we don't have a police problem. Then there were 3 police shootings in January of this year. Miguel Gregory in Ansonia, Mubarak Solomon in West Haven, and Edward Dendron in Waterbury. But we don't have a problem in Connecticut, and I think that's part of the problem. Our governor can't see beyond Greenwich, Connecticut. There's a whole big, a lot of cities around here. Greenwich is not the only one. So you may not have a problem in Greenwich, but we have a lot of problems with police shootings in our urban centers. And according to the Washington Post, since 2015, which was Ferguson, which we thought lit up the nation around police shootings, in 2000, this is what the Post reported, that since then, nearly 1,000 people have been killed annually by our police. And most of them have been black, unarmed, and between the age of 20 and 40. 2015, it was 994 police shootings. 2016, it was 960. 2017, it was 986. 2018, it was 991. 2019 was 1,004. And in 2020, only up to June, there have already been 463. I'm sure there's probably, and that was 49 higher than it was June of last year. But we don't have a problem in Connecticut. Today is also the 5th anniversary. There's two things significant about today. It's the 5th anniversary of the mass shooting at Emmanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And that was just a symptom of a deeply diseased nation. That's when the young man went into a church, prayed with the people for a whole hour, and then got up and shot him. This is our nation. Because, you know, our Attorney General and our President doesn't see racism as a problem either. Today is also the 49th anniversary of the American War on Drugs, which has stolen so many lives. And if you look at, you can Google it, the whole intent of the war on drugs was selectively enforced, but the reason was, how do we disrupt those black communities, black and brown communities? And so they introduced, Nixon, the war on drugs. 49 years of destroying our communities, and the war continues. I haven't seen no end to it, no one talking about it. I don't even hear anybody protesting it. So we just continue to just normalize so much abuse, and we have to step up. We have to do more than we have been doing. I think about the drug raid that killed a 17-year-old, Ayanna Stanley. She's laying on her couch. The police burst into a house over a drug raid and killed that 7-year-old girl laying on the couch. This is all behind the war on drugs. We need to step up and start fighting back in different ways and consistently fight until these wars end against us. The governor signed the executive order the other day addressing police accountability. But I hope you were paying attention, because that was about state police. It wasn't about holding local police accountable. It was about the state police. So we need to make sure the governor realizes we need to also take care of police accountability in our local areas. And that's one of the things that we're pushing our legislators to come back to talk about. The Democrats in Congress, after how many years of doing absolutely nothing, now have established a Justice and Policing Act for 2020.
It's all about money.
I think it's all a bunch of BS, and unless we make them enforce something that's real for us.
Yes, that's what I'm for.
I think these are just some of the things that I think we have to do. We need a national registry for police who abuse and kill. We need police to have a mandatory duty to intervene when they see another officer abusing. Legislators need to provide whistleblower protection for those officers who do want to come forth and complain about what they see their brethren doing. Because without that, they're not going to come forth. Officers need to have an annual mental health check. And if they're not fit for duty, they should be disqualified to continue. We have to shift the police culture. Legislation, like Kenneth Green said, legislation alone is not going to do it. They have to change the culture from that warrior mentality to a guardian. You're the police as a servant.
Put that mentality
to protect
in place.
And serve.
They
It's not always about law enforcement. In the suburbs, yeah, it's about protect and serve. But in urban centers, it's about law enforcement. We need to make sure that they realize when you police, wherever you police, you are a servant, providing a service for the people. Another thing might be good, if you're fired for misconduct, there shouldn't be a pension. Give you the money, whatever you put in it, that's all you get. You don't get to live off the people for the rest of your life after you have shot and killed and abused our citizens. And if anyone decides that they're going to retire or resign in the midst of investigation, again, no pension. You just get what you put into it, because now you're trying to escape being held accountable. We need to mandate that Connecticut legislation mandates for the Connecticut Post their standard of training. Make it a mandate as opposed to this is how we train and cities and don't have to abide by. We need to have it in legislation that is mandated. What they put in training, that's what all officers have to do no matter where they are. Racism and police protection need to be curtailed in the law. We need to change the language that says, which is why a lot of police officers get away with murder, is because of the language. Instead of saying that that we have to prove that the officer was willful or had intent, we have to just show that he had disregard for the well-being of another human being, and let that be the thing that prosecute them. That's why a lot of them get away with murder, and they know they can get away with murder because they know according to the language, if you can't prove intent or that it was willful, then you can say not guilty, and most of them do get away with murder.
Accountability.
We also need to curb qualified immunity, which makes them exempt from being civilly lawsuit if they commit murder or whatever they commit. That needs to end. If you abuse someone, the city should not have to pay for it. The taxpayers should not have to pay for it. You should have to pay for it. So maybe we have to have all our police officers insured to make sure that if they do something wrong, they're the ones paying the price, not the taxpayers.
That's right. Accountability.
When we talked about, we slightly talked about COVID in prison. And I just wanted to bring up a name of one person that's in prison right now that I can't understand why he's not released. His name is Darrell Floyd. He's 61 years old. He's diabetic. He has a blood clot in his right leg and his right lung. He's in Carl Robinson, less than 60 days left to serve. Why is he still sitting in prison? That's because our governor can't see beyond Greenwich. He can't see our pain and suffering. He can't understand why he needs to take people out of prison that are just sitting ducks for this COVID infection. We've had 7 people, and someone told me 8 people who have died in less than a month. And still, this governor can't hear that we need to do something to release people from getting COVID in prison. So after the protest, we need to recognize that we have a long road ahead. And so I hope that we're all up to that. There's a lot of work to be done. When the session is open, we need to make sure we're aware of it, and the best way to be aware of it is to get in touch with your legislators and make sure that they email you, text you, or whatever to let you know the session is open. And we need to have this ground packed with people demanding that they take care of 2 important bills: police accountability, and I mean real accountability. Police accountability and take care of inner solitary confinement. The last thing we should have did with sick people was put them in Northern, and that's where people have ended up being. So I just wanted to, I think I want to end there, but one thing that keeps me going, like Mr. Green was saying, like we've been doing this work for so many years, but many times I get frustrated, but I keep hearing Maya Angelou ringing in my ears, and she said we may face many defeats, but we should never be defeated. And so that's how I feel. I refuse to let America defeat us. 401 years of fighting for justice, and I think it's time for us to get real justice. When we come back in session, we will not accept these baby steps to justice, because that's all we've had for 401 years, baby steps, and that's why we're not much further. We need to get bold and courageous legislators who are going to do the work that needs to be done. We're not going to take any more compromised policies. We need policies that really work. And if Black Lives Matter and Brown Lives Matter, then we're going to fight to the helm until we get exactly that and nothing less. Thank you.
Justice if they vote on what they put up to vote for us.
I want to call up Rahisha
It's all about the
to
benefits.
speak about, I think you're going to speak about solitary confinement, right?
Whatever
Rahisha?
you want, my
So
dear.
Rahisha, she's part of Stop Solitary too. So we got her and one other speaker, so I don't want to keep you too long, because I don't never like to do that. I say 1 hour and that's it. But I'm sorry we went a little over, but we're going to bring it to an end. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. Let's give it up for Barbara one more time. So, I joined Stop Solitary last September after my own brother, who has schizophrenia, was incarcerated almost 3 years ago. And as someone who practiced social work for over 12 years, I did not realize how broken our justice system was until I experienced it as a family member. And, you know, to have a whole block full of people with mental illness in a prison where they're in their cells for 21 hours out of the day just so doesn't work. And we do not have a system that currently rehabilitates people. And I actually want to read a quote, and I promise I won't keep you here for long, that kind of sets the context for what we're currently seeing and dealing with in society, right? Because you have a lot of people reacting to the violence, to the riots, and what Dr. Martin Luther King said years ago is that riots is the voice of the unheard. And America has failed to hear and recreate the trauma, the injustice, the lack of workability in our systems. And to many people, people incarcerated are invisible. And when things are invisible to people, sometimes they don't care. And what we're out here for today is that people hear the invisible hurt and the very invisible stories of people that are incarcerated. Not only is solitary confinement ineffective, it is actually found that people who experience solitary sometimes are more violent, and within as few as 5 days, solitary confinement can actually impact people and cause irreparable damage. Irreparable. Someone can be harmed for the rest of their life by being in solitary confinement for 5 days. It doesn't work. So, as the session starts, I invite you to be out here with us as partners. Clearly, you're people who already care about this issue, but I have another invitation for you, right? Because I heard the young lady speak who left earlier who was just frustrated that she's been protesting for 10 years, right? And how many people are like, you're also frustrated, like, when is this gonna give? Right? And sometimes it could be that way. Today, as I was preparing myself to come up, I was like, I just want to go to the beach. That was a thought. I showed up, right? But this work takes energy. And my invitation to you is that, yes, we will fight legislatively to change the system. But a lot of the things that are going to make a difference can start in just a conversation with someone. If you have someone in your family, if you have a work colleague that you know is racist or that you know have views that do not help us, I invite you and I challenge you to challenge that person. Interact with them from love to change their mind. And we can start to make a difference there. The most moving thing I ever participated in was about 3 weeks ago when we sat on the steps with the police chief in New Haven. And after the protest and after the interviews with the news station, you know, what I said is, even if he is gonna make a statement that, you know, the people being released are causing more violence, he needs to come and he needs to work with the activists to cause a different solution and a different result. And he came out. And communication, if we can communicate with one another, that could actually resolve some of the issues that we're having. So, to end, I believe that if the police force is trained around communication, and not only communication, but respecting people's humanity at the very basic nature, we are all human, we all bleed red, that things will change. If you were familiar with the incident that happened at Walmart a couple weeks ago, where there were about, I think, 6 police officers that arrested someone at Walmart down the street from where I live. If you watch the video, there was a point in that video where the guy was resisting. He had already put all the stuff back from Walmart. Clearly he wasn't gonna walk out stealing things. And that officer had a choice. He could have actually said, hey, this can go one of 2 ways. I don't wanna approach you if you're not allowing the arrest, but I want you. He could have talked him down and had that arrest go differently. Instead, he continued to try to get to him physically. And I truly believe that until our officers, you know, get training and also have training for how to interact with people with mental illness, the system is not going to change. So that's, you know, what I believe we need to also advocate for, is that the police officers have training, that they're evaluated for their mental health, as Ms. Fields said, but also that they're evaluated for their own inherent biases. We all have biases, but when they go unchecked, when we're unwilling to acknowledge them, that's when it causes a disaster. So thank you for joining today, and that is all.
I know I said one more, but I really need to get Stacy Rivera up because I hate when families here and they don't get to say something. But I know her son is in Northern, and that's one of the places we really want to shut down. So if you could just give us an update on how your son is doing in Northern.
My son is currently incarcerated in Northern Correctional Institute, and I mean, he has his good days, he has his bad days, but a lot of this is brought upon police brutality, which, as so many others said, extends into the court system and into the prison system. But I feel that a lot of people need to understand that what goes on behind closed doors is just as bad as what is being done out in public. And people need to advocate for change within the correctional system. Yes. Everybody is advocating for police reform. We need to wake up and advocate for our incarcerated loved ones and for everyone that doesn't have someone to advocate for them. There's not only people on the streets dying, there's people that's incarcerated that are dying. Mm-hmm. We have 2 deaths in Connecticut, and there's probably more. That's all I could kind of find quickly before I came here today. They were ruled homicide within the Department of Corrections system. Carl Talbot, and then there was another one, a young man by the name of Jalen, 31 years old. No one talks about that. That's right. You have had 44 people supposedly committed suicide within the Department of Correction in the past 10 years. You understand? You have people that have died because of medical neglect.
That is correct.
You understand? So we need to not just focus on police brutality, we need to focus on the entire picture. Like the young lady said about the prosecutors, absolutely right. But the public needs to understand, and they need to know that you have the right to give the prosecutor. Right now, 2 prosecutors are going up for renewal for June 30th. A lot of people are maybe not aware of that, but the Connecticut.gov website invites the public to give a review on these prosecutors. So if you pay attention and you wake up, people want to know how they can get involved. We can actually get involved by spreading the news, letting other people know that they have these rights, that they can review these prosecutors and they can find out what's going on within their cities and within their state. But I'm going to go back to the correctional system once again. When we go into special session, we need to advocate for reform within the correctional system. We need to get legislators to know what's going on when it comes to these inmates that are incarcerated. What is it, Chapter 325 in the Connecticut General Statute, which is about the correctional system. They need to review that. And they need to go in and they need to find out about these outdated directives that are from 1975 that are basically affecting inmates today, from inmates eye-rolling, yelling, they're getting put in solitary confinement. Like my son is in there for being denied medical treatment. He advocated, yes, he took the CO's logbook, which he shouldn't have, but that doesn't warrant him serving his sentence in Northern. 23-hour lockdown. It's segregation, but it's more than that. It's being treated as an animal. He cannot come out of a cell without being shackled from the legs around his waist, behind his back. He even has shackles on while he's taking a shower. 1 15-minute phone call a week. If it wasn't for COVID-19, yes, they give him 2 free phone calls now, 3 phone calls per week, but if we didn't have this, it would be 1 15-minute phone call. So how do you think that affects all of the other incarcerated individuals that are there? 15 minutes to talk to a loved one? What do you have to look forward to when you're locked up for 23 hours a day? When they only come to ask you if you want to go to rec at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning because they know you're sleeping and you're going to refuse. Or you're not going to get up. Or once you get up, they say, oh, it's too late, you can't go now. You took 10 minutes to get yourself together. So not only is it police reform, we need to reform within the whole system. That's right. Because like I said, they need to be accountable for their actions. They need to be accountable for their use of force, excessive force. They need to let these videotapes, there's over 400 cameras within the Department of Correction. Why isn't any of those videos out to the public? Why isn't anyone seeing that? I've been trying to get a video of my son since January. I've had a lawyer, I've contacted the senator, another lawyer, still nothing. I've sent in Freedom of Information Act requests since January, still nothing. So what is going to be done about that? Why is that okay?
Right. It's not.
So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you.
just want you to know that Stop Solitary is definitely about incarceration. Our two-pronged thing that we want legislators to address is prisons and police accountability. And so we'll have Cindy to come up, and then I guess we can close. Is this your song?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
Hi, I just want to, my name is Cindy Prizio. I'm here as a justice-involved family. I have a justice-impacted child, and I'm executive director of a nonprofit, One Standard of Justice. I want to give you an update. The DOC said they were going to have all testing of our vulnerable population, our people housed in prisons, by the end of June. I think last week they did the third facility. 110 people out of probably about 350 were found to be positive for COVID at Brooklyn CI. They're calling it asymptomatic, Nobody wants to leave and be threatened with going to Northern. So I don't know how accurate that is, and we're still waiting on inconclusive tests on 10 or more people. So I believe that Governor Lamont and the DOC came forward and said, we're going to start testing for COVID around the time Lamont had already said, we're going to reopen the state, and we're going to test 7,000 people a day. Meanwhile, we have 10,000 people incarcerated, and not a single one of them had been tested for COVID. Something is wrong with that when the facilities are petri dishes. I sat at a couple of tables with the Catal and solitary confinement and others, and we had a coalition, and we were appealing to the common sense and compassion and humanity of the Department of Correction in Lamont to let our people go, the ones that certainly were qualified to go home. And of course we were ignored and denied. So this sign came up about as long as there's breath, there's hope, probably around the time Carlos de Leon was the first man to die in prison of COVID. And of course, the story there is he should have been released back in a month or 2 months earlier, but he didn't have an approved housing plan. How dare they? Then, of course, this has taken on new meaning after the death of George Floyd. But if you're a mother of an incarcerated person, or a person who is incarcerated, you also know that there's an elephant sitting on your chest, that you too, as a mother, cannot breathe because of the trauma you're going through, because you can't help your child who may or may not should have been incarcerated. So I want to tell you a couple of stories. About 5 years ago, I've been now 2 administrations. I've been here for Governor Malloy and Mike Waller, and I've been and the commissioner was Semple, and I've been here for, we're not even halfway home yet, but Governor Lamont, Commissioner Roland Cook, who just resigned, and Mark Pelka, the undersecretary under Lamont. And I'm going to tell you, I'm new. You know, I had my head buried in the sand, and I started getting educated about 5 years ago. So I went off to meet Commissioner Semple, and there was a lot of, we had grievances we needed to discuss with him. And he dismissed everybody in the room, and he talked to me privately. And he said, if you think I'm ever going to take the word of an inmate over a corrections officer, he said basically I was crazy. And that's exactly the reason we're in this kind of trouble today, quite honestly. There are bad corrections officers just like there's good ones. And he had spoken publicly about that there's a small percentage of, besides being bad, that are actually sadistic. And the sadistic ones are so mean-spirited, and they get their little mini-me followers. And our loved ones, doesn't matter what color, they're being persecuted inside. 2 weeks ago, we sat here and we heard Robin Porter. I've never heard Rep. Porter's story about her son being beaten up in a New Haven jail. He was taken in the back room, and the story is, if it can happen to Rep. Porter's son, no one is protected. And I'm here to tell you, I'm working with another family today, a person of color, and it's a suit in federal court. And the same thing happened. He was on the phone with his loved one. He was carried off by 6 corrections officers to a back room, and he was beaten the crap out of. And quite frankly, no one, I don't care, no one deserves that kind of treatment. So when I say that we cannot accept incrementalism, and that's what I heard on the Black Puerto Rican Caucus call 2 weeks ago, no more Band-Aids and no more half measures. I said on Monday that this was my Monday morning metaphor. Humpty Dumpty cannot be put back together again. Shame on us if we accept less than our people and our communities deserve. So I'm here to just thank you. I want to thank Barbara. She's tireless, even though she complains about being tired. But I'm here to say enough is enough. And I'm white and I can't do anything about it. And I'm over 60 and I can't do anything about that. But I know firsthand, I'm a mother of somebody who's been traumatized by a bad system. And the arrogance, they are getting away with murder inside our prisons and on the streets of our black and brown communities. And we better stand up in solidarity and say, no more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for everyone who came out in support for us. Hopefully we'll hear soon that the governor is going to open up the session. But in the meantime, like Kenneth Green said, get in touch with your legislators, have some meetings so you'll know what it is that they're going to be trying to sell us during the session. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you, Bob. All right. Thank you. All right. Former Representative Green, right? Everybody is like calling you representative. They want you back. Are you coming back? That's the first question.
No, I'm not coming
He
back.
says I'm not coming back.
I actually tried it a couple of times, and the people chose otherwise. So that's good.
I got you. Okay, so
He was another one of those fighters. That's why I hope people come
Want to
back.
talk tomorrow?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. All right. Call me. when you
Yeah.
have, like 5 solid minutes.
Sure. So what made you come out today? I know you know Barbara Fair, and you worked together in the past as in the world of advocacy, or
Well, a couple of things. One,
yeah.
I'm a social worker, and I'm part of the Greater Hartford Alliance of Black Social Workers. And we are actually one of the groups that support the Connecticut Solitary Connecticut. So we support the efforts of that group. But as a social worker and a former legislator, I've always fought for equity and justice. And part of what was happening with the police accountability talk and what's happening is that knowing the legislative process,
We gotta stay on top of this.
the people in public service will give you some sound bites.
They
will
already
give
said
you,
they're planning
will almost say the right things right now
So we
around
gotta make sure
inequality and racial justice and police accountability. But after that's over, what does the policy that's going to be developed really do? How do we hold people accountable? So once that policy and that legislation is there, and then how do we make sure that if later on we feel like it's not working, how do we come back? One of the main things is that policy development, especially around this area, has to have consequences. They have to have some kinds of mandates, requirements, and they also have to be, if things don't happen the way you expect it to happen, or let me put it this way, if you can talk about police accountability and they don't do the things that you want them to do, how can they be held accountable? There's a lot of ways to do that, but you want to put that in the legislation so you're very clear. You don't necessarily want feel-good legislation at this time.
Right.
You want something with teeth.
Because it's not going to make a difference. It's not going to have any standing power.
But I also think that at some point you got to have in the community a discussion about the role of the police and the relationship of neighbors with neighbors. Because when people say, and when Barbara said, you can't call the police for everything. You can't have the police protect, serve, and police your community.
Right.
People have to, the neighbors, the community has to police their community.
Right.
And so what needs to happen is that you also have to have the discussion as to why do we think we need the police to do these things? So we got to address issues around domestic violence. We got to address issues around substance use and abuse.
Yeah.
We have to address issues around mental health. And those kind of issues have to be addressed from the community-based point of view. Because once you get the police involved in those kind of situations, I think, as you said, they're not well trained to deal with folks who are not necessarily at their best mental state at that moment.
Right.
And then sometimes, unfortunately, the police aren't at their best mental state.
To deal with that,
To deal with that, because they're coming in, somebody said, from a law enforcement perspective, and you're coming in from a protect my community and help my neighbor kind of strategy. And sometimes they don't mix if you don't have the discussion. So, as I said, let's first of all get rid of the us versus them.
Right.
We're all humans, and let's deal with the humanity.
Yep.
And then let's also understand that the community has to say, I don't want you to live. I don't want you to be. I want you to have an opportunity for education. I want you to have this. I want you to respect the norms of the community, so that I don't have to have the police come in and manage my behavior. The community should do that. Yep. We have issues in education. We have issues around domestic violence. We have issues around mental health that needs to be addressed in a different way than what we ask in the role of the police to be. So that's another conversation that also should be parallel going with the police accountability.
Yeah.
If you hold the police accountable and you want them to do something, what happens when you see two people fighting in your community? Are you going to intervene to say that's not what we do, or are you going to call the police? If you see somebody committing larceny or burglary, are you going to call the police, or are you going to intervene? So some of those kind of conversations has to be, how are we conducting ourselves and our behavior in our community where we feel like we need to call them? You have people with mental health issues. There's a whole lot of stuff that we have to talk about with that, but using the police and the prisons to now be the people that deal with it and the places that house those folks is not the answer.
Yeah, beautiful.
There's a lot of work we got to do on a lot of different fronts. There's enough work for everybody to do, and so, if they just, if people take certain roles to say, this is what I do well, this is what teamwork, this is what I
community
this
and
is what
government working
this
together.
This is what I feel I can do. Do your thing, and let me support you, and let me do what I'm good at and what I'm interested in, and support me. But there's so much work to be done.
Well, the system systematically caused all our problems from the birth of our nation.
That's what I was going to ask. There's so many people, and I feel like younger people getting involved, after the killing of George Floyd. And what's the one piece of advice you would have for people that really want to make a difference and they want to make a change, and maybe they don't know how to get started or where to start?
People to decide.
Get started in your local community. A couple of places. One, with yourself. Do some reflection and say, can I find an issue that I'm passionate about and get involved? Find a group in your local community that's doing that, and then do that and work with that group. So start with your family and your local community, and then possibly go to the internet and go to places.
I think the United Nations
through the
is
social
where we
media
should
and find out
global
who's
warming is
fighting
happening.
for the issue that you
We're
want.
not doing anything
Now,
about it.
The other thing that I would say though, when you go to do that, you go to do that to help, not to hurt. You go to do that without the ego and the idea that you're going to get some kind of glory or some kind of recognition for that. You go to do that because you feel that you want to be a change agent, and it's not about you.
Yeah.